Although Thor wasn't exactly a fan-favorite Avenger back in 2011, must be said that Taika Waititi changed things when he refurbished the character in 2017, and with Thor: Love and Thunder set to release in July of next year, goes without saying that fans are beyond excited for what's next. But what does Thor look like behind the scenes, and what does CGI add to his character? For all this and more, stay tuned. Firstly, the creation of Asgard. First up on our list is the creation of Asgard, the magical homeworld of Thor that can be found thousands of galaxies away from Earth's own solar system. But rather than sticking to the usual sci-fi tropes that can be found in hundreds of movies nowadays, the production team made sure to breathe life into the concept art created based on the comic books. You see, Asgard is a lot more than a simple creation. It's a realm of legend found in Norse mythology within which the Aesir live. As such, concept artists on the payroll made sure to introduce the audience to a place that is not only steeped in technological wonder, but looks somewhat historical and similar to what the Vikings of decades back would have envisioned. It might surprise you to hear that not every inch of Asgard was CGI though. There are certain scenes in which sets were built to mimic what was going to be happening on screen. A great example of this can be found in the Asgard throne room, where Thor takes his stand against Hela. The curving throne with an inward-facing snakeheads was built from scratch, as well as the walls from either side of Thor. The Hela was backed up by a blue screen, which allowed for a long hallway to be virtually created and placed into the scene. A number of filters were then placed over the scene in an effort to enhance it, adding detail and color. Next, Hela herself looked completely different on set. While on the topic of Hela, we can't continue without giving the VFX department its dues when it came to the completion of her character. For those of you who don't know, Cate Blanchett was brought on to portray the biggest villain Thor had faced up to that point, the goddess of death herself, and the concept artists employed by Waititi knew that they would have to take advantage of Blanchett's raw sexuality in order to bring this goddess to life. But rather than knitting her out in a skin-tight outfit, which would have made the combat scenes incredibly difficult to film, they placed the actress in a motion capture suit similar to what Mark Ruffalo had to wear when bringing Hulk to life. This allowed VFX wizards to go in to create Hela's suit from scratch. This way, Hela's outfit was given a life of its own. Rather than appearing material in nature, she came across as someone who was draped in pure necrotic energy, which clearly added to her character. Suffice to say, those stylish spikes that protruded from her head were also pure CGI, which allowed Hela to make them appear out of nowhere just before launching into an attack on Asgard. The same technology was then used for Hela's necrotic swords, which she could make weapons appear out of nowhere. The VFX department had to be called in to make this look realistic, and they did so with an unsheathing effect from her sleeves. Up next, Mark Ruffalo had a much easier job. As we mentioned earlier, Blanchett wasn't the only cast member kitted out in a motion capture suit. Since Hulk was due to show up on Sakaar, Mark Ruffalo also needed to don a similar suit, but with some added differences. You see, Hulk is a pure creation of the VFX department, and when something is being rendered fully, a lot more work has to go into making Perpulus feel real and a part of the broader world. That's why Ruffalo also had to wear a facial rig that would register his expressions while acting. This wasn't a problem with Blanchett, whose face looked exactly the same as Hela's. Hulk, on the other hand, merely shares some facial features with Ruffalo, and when Thor Ragnarok came along, things were made even more difficult since Hulk had been given dialogue. This meant that the VFX department had to concentrate on his facial features so that sufficient emotion could be displayed when brought out in post, which is why the team decided to fit the custom-made head rig to Ruffalo. More often than not, Ruffalo wasn't even in the shot. He was placed in a booth where he would perform his lines. The VFX wizards would then do their thing and superimpose the image onto the already created CGI Hulk. And when things had been touched up to a sufficient degree, it looked as if Hulk was actually a real person with trusted emotions. Pretty impressive feat. Now let's dive into how Hemsworth had difficulty acting all alone. Chris Hemsworth, who fans of the MCU will know as the one and only Thor, has also said in the past that portraying the character can be quite difficult. You see, when it came to Thor Ragnarok, he was about the only person on set dressed to the nines. And more often than not, he was the only true character on set. In his fight against Hulk within the Grand Arena of Sakaar, for example, he was actually on his own. Hulk was, of course, completely CGI in this scene, with the intense fighting being nothing more than a virtual rendering of the storyboard created by the concept artists. But Hemsworth had to try his best to address Hulk in a believable way, and when dealing with CGI characters, this can be a bit difficult. That's why the production team created a bust of Hulk that was placed on the head of a crew member. This allowed Hemsworth to at least know where he should be looking when delivering his lines. The crew member was then eradicated from the scene in post-production, with the bust of Hulk then being used as a placeholder for where the character should be standing. The Grand Arena itself was a virtual creation of the VFX department too, and we're not just talking about the structure of the arena, but the audience as well, all of whom took the form of CGI doubles, so the crew didn't have to rely on thousands of extras. Up next, bringing Fenrir to life. Another fully CGI character that made waves when Ragnarok first released was Renrir the Wolf, which is actually a comic book character based on a demigod from the Aesir pantheon. According to Norse mythology, Fenrir was actually the son of Loki, who could himself turn into a wolf and frolic around Asgard. And since it's Fenrir who gives birth to the wolves who then bring on Ragnarok, Waititi knew that he had to introduce the audience to this incredible creature. At first, the idea was to have a smaller dog transform into a massive wolf, but since the budget of the film had already risen to insane heights, the decision was made to render Fenrir from scratch and keep him in his massive wolf form. What really made this difficult is the environment in which his actions were taking place. If you remember the movie well, you'll know that Hulk fights Fenrir in the Asgardian Sea, and while rendering realistic looking fur is a job on its own, you can imagine how impossible it became with the addition of water effects. The VFX department had to spend days ensuring that Fenrir's fur looked sufficiently clumped and tussled together because of the environmental effects around him. But in the end, they succeeded in bringing the legendary creature to life. On set though, all that was really required was a green screen area over which to project these CGI models of Hulk and the godly wolf, quite different from the scene we saw. Now, the true extent of Thor's virtual effects. By the end of Ragnarok, Thor was sufficiently damaged by his world-ending journey, but it's this journey that caused him to notice that he never needed Mjolnir to call on his thunderous power. This was great news for fans of the character, but terrible news for the virtual effects department, who had to painstakingly render lightning each and every time he kicked or punched in that final fight scene. These wizards on the payroll also had to convince the audience that Thor had lost an eye, which was done using CGI superimposed over the face of Hemsworth. But that's not all. Hemsworth also had to be hooked up to a couple of wire rigs that transported him around the set and allowed for the fluid motion of his character through the air. Suffice to say, these wires had to be painted out in post-production, and last but not least, the weapons used by Thor in Ragnarok also had to be created with the use of VFX magic. In other words, Hemsworth not only had to fight against imaginary enemies, he also had to do so using imaginary weapons. Who knew things were so hard for him? And there you have it, how Thor and his home world of Asgard looked without CGI. What do you think of the Marvel Cinematic Universe? And which virtual effects surprised you the most? Be sure to let us know in the comments section down below.